Right, so modern Perl catch-up. I thought I'd have a London theme for the slides for March last year. So what we're going to talk about over the next couple of hours is some new things in Perl that you might have missed. Some of you, as I said 5 minutes ago, have been coming to my classes at London Perl workshops for many years, and you might be thinking, hey, look, haven't we done this before? Well, yes. So in December 2011, five years ago, I did a talk called Modern Core Perl, and we talked about new things that have been added to the core of Perl over the last 5 years. So this is kind of a sequel to that talk. We'll start by talking a little bit about the way that Perl gets released. Perl gets released annually, has been for several years now, 6 years, 7 years maybe. It comes out about in the spring, April, May time. Very important thing to know, and I still find when I go to client sites that people don't know this. The even numbered versions are the production releases, and when I say even numbered, I mean the number that comes after the 5, because 5 is obviously not an even number. But 522, 524, 526, they are the production releases of Perl. Those are the versions that you should be running on your systems. Odd number versions are the development releases. They aren't guaranteed to be stable, so you really don't want to put them anywhere near your production system. So that's 521, 23, 25, etc. One thing I didn't say at the start is many of you, as I say, know how I do these talks, but if there's anything that I say that you don't understand or you think I'm wrong about, then feel free to speak up and ask questions and stuff. I'm really happy to run these sessions as a dialogue, so please stop me if you want to make me look stupid in front of the rest of the class, and I'm really happy for that to happen. So currently people, I say we because it's not me, I have nothing to do with this. People are working on 525, and that at some point in about 5 or 6 months' time will become Perl 526, and everything will be good. So officially, Perl releases are supported for 2 years, or rather the current release and the previous release are the releases that are supported by the Perl 5 porters, the people that actually work on Perl. If you want to see the full details of that policy, there's a documentation page, perl.perl policy. So currently, Perl 522 and Perl 524 are officially supported. I find that can sometimes be a nice way to put a bit of a rocket under a manager that won't let you upgrade to a more recent version of Perl. If we're not using Perl 522 or 524, we're using an unsupported version of Perl, and that kind of scares people, which is good. There is limited support for older versions. The Perl 5 porters are a volunteer group, and they will do what they can, but it's really strictly on a best efforts kind of basis. Of course, if you've bought your Perl from a vendor, and this is why people use Red Hat, for example, then you will have longer support for your version of Perl from the vendor. They will try to backport fixes and things like that. Any questions? No. Good.
Do vendors not then supply their backports themselves back to Perl if they're supporting older versions and they not supplying back to?
I guess it varies is the best answer to that. So, do you have anything to add? No? Sometimes. So the answer, the takeaway from this is that you should update your version of Perl, and using the system Perl is generally not a very good idea for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that if you're stuck using, for example, putting time out of my head, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6, that's a fairly common version of Linux that people use in production, then you'll be using Perl 5.10.1 because that's the version, and that's the version that comes with that version of Red Hat, and these vendors, they will not update it through a major version number during the lifetime of that release. So Red Hat 6 will always come with Perl 5.10. So if you want a more recent version of Perl, then you need to build your own. And the two tools, excuse me, Perl Brew and Clem are good ways to get your own version of Perl. And hopefully by the end of this morning's session, you'll have lots of good reasons why you want to upgrade past the system version of Perl that you have installed. Right, any questions on that before we start leaping into actual versions? I didn't sound this bad when I woke up this morning.
Do you want a fisherman's friend?
No, thank you, I'm fine. I'll live. So, Perl 5.16 is the first version that we're going to cover. The previous version went from 5.10 to 5.14. So Perl 5.16 came out in 2012. There's a few updates to it. Current version, Perl 5.16.3 came out in about almost a year later. Some things we're going to look at. The sub marker, fold case, develop deprof, Perl experiment, Perl Overtut, the other older documents that were reviewed, and Unicode 6.1. Sub. So sub is a new source token that was added to Perl. So that's two underscores. This font doesn't really show it particularly well. It's two underscores, the word sub, and two other underscores. There are three other similar tokens within the Perl parser: recognize, package, file, and line. And if you just use those in your source code, then they will get replaced by the current package, the current file name, and the current file, the current line number, all thereabouts. The sub one that's been added is slightly different. It doesn't give you the name of the current subroutine, it returns a reference to the current subroutine. And this makes it a little easier to write recursive subroutines. I know how much we all love writing recursive subroutines. And the rule is, if you talk about recursive subroutines, the example you have to use is the Fibonacci sequence. So here is a very simple implementation of the Fibonacci sequence, and you can see it's recursive because it calls itself, which is kind of the definition of recursion. So it calls itself twice. Everyone's seen something similar to that? Everyone understands what it's saying? Yes. So the problem comes is and the problem's probably overstating the case a little bit. When you rename that routine, fib's a terrible name for a subroutine, it should be called Fibonacci number or something like that. Because not only do you need to rename it there, but then you're going to forget to rename it here and here. So if we use this new sub token, then the subroutine looks pretty much the same, except here we've replaced the name of the subroutine with the token. And because what we've got here is a reference to the subroutine rather than the subroutine name, we've had to add the subroutine dereferencing lookup arrow thingy. Clear? Has anyone come across this and used it yet? Couple of people.
In unnamed subroutines.
Sorry?
In unnamed subroutines.
In unnamed subroutines. Oh yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah, it's a lifesaver.
Yeah. That's pretty much the only way to call an unnamed subroutine. Fold case. Who's heard of fold case? Yeah, you don't have to put your hand for everything. You've got two strings that might be in different cases, and you want to compare that they're the same. So you do lowercase of this equals lowercase of that, right? You've all done that? Right? Wrong. Unicode complicates everything. And by the way, if you think that you don't need to care about Unicode, you're wrong. I'm no expert in Unicode. I can get things to work. But there are complicated corner cases in Unicode where lowercasing strings that should be the same, and you don't end up with the same strings. And so you can't just switch to uppercase because the same holds true for uppercase. So actually Unicode has this concept called fold case, which is there pretty much specifically to answer this problem. It's a new case that's guaranteed that you can match strings correctly. So there's a new FC function that you can use to actually make these corrections, make these comparisons, and also there is a /f that you can use in a quoted string, the same way as you can use /l and /u. If you're doing comparisons of strings that contain Unicode characters, then you should be using this for safety. You probably hadn't come across any of the corner cases yet, so you don't realise that you've got a bug in your code, but you might do. Who has ever used devel dprof? Very tiny number of you. So it was a profiling tool. Who's ever profiled their code in some way? By profiling, I mean running your code in a manner whereby you can get information about how long each line or each function took to execute, so that you can work out where the slow bits are, where the bottlenecks are, and you can speed things, so you know where to look in order to speed things up. And for years, devel dprof was the standard Perl profiling tool, and it was included as a standard part of Perl. But as that survey just showed, nobody ever used it because it was really difficult to use and quite hard to understand, and people just didn't bother. So there's a thing called devel nytprof, which isn't, it didn't get added into the Perl core, but it's there on CPAN, and it's a much nicer profiling tool. It's nicer in many ways. It's a statement level profiler rather than a subroutine level profiler, which davorg dprof was. And it draws pretty graphs. You get HTML pages out of it, which you can show to your manager, and they like pretty things and colour coding and stuff like that. It's much better tool. If you have to profile stuff, then NYTprof is a much better tool. And as no one's used davorg dprof in this room, or only a couple of us, no one's going to miss it.
I haven't used it since NYTprof.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Perl experiment, a new manual page that was added in Perl 5.16. New documentation page that basically lists the experiments in the current version of Perl. So quite a few things have been added to Perl, going back the last 10 years or so. Not all of them have proved to be successful, as we'll see in some of the later versions that we cover. And so the Perl 5 porters, I almost said we again, have introduced this concept of experimental, where new features are added and they are marked as experimental, which means that if you run code that uses them, then you'll get warnings to say you're using an experimental feature, and we can't guarantee that this feature will be stable or even here in future versions of Perl. So Perl experiment will list what is currently marked as an experimental feature in your current version of Perl. Often when people talk about the documentation that comes with Perl, they will say, go to perl.perl.org to read the manual pages. If you're looking at something like Perl.doc experiment, which changes each time a new version of Perl comes out, it is vital that you use the right version of the Perl.doc. Otherwise you're going to get broken information, out-of-date information. So you can either just run Perl.doc on your local system, where you're pretty much guaranteed that what you're seeing matches the version of Perl you've got installed, or if you go to the Perl.doc webpage, there is actually a drop-down where you can choose the version of Perl that the documentation is for. So if you're looking at anything, you should really make sure that you're looking at the right version. But for things like this, it's vitally important, otherwise you'll get information that doesn't matter, doesn't count at all. And there's a comparison between, so Perl.perl experiment contains a list of the current experiments. There's another manual page, Perl.doc experimental, which documents the experimental pragma which you use within Perl in order to use experimental things. Perl 5.16 had a massive reboot to the OO Perl documentation. We had 3 or 4 OO manual pages in Perl for a very long time, back to the beginning of Perl 5, and they were looking a little bit dated. So actually, I should have looked up. I can't remember who it was that wrote the new version. Does anyone know?
Dave Rolski?
Dave Rolski, maybe? Yeah, that sounds likely.
I think it was a friend from DPF.
Oh, okay. And so he basically just rewrote the OO documentation from scratch. Huge improvement on the previous versions, really up to date. And it covers OO frameworks, which of course has been the big change in OO Perl over the last 10 years, is the use of frameworks like Moose and Move rather than raw Perl OO. It mentions in these in this document Moose, Move, class successor, class tiny, and role tiny. So I guess to some extent you can consider those like the approved OO frameworks, but that's the ones that you all use anyway, right? any questions on this? So the other half of that was that the old OO docs were all removed. Perl boot, which was the basic OO tutorial. Perl toot, Tom's OO tutorial. Perl boot was written by Randall Schwartz, and Perl toot was written by Tom Christensen. It never really became clear why we needed two tutorials that basically covered the same material. And Perl bot was Tom's bag of object tricks, which never got confused for Perl boot ever by anyone. And so there's this new Perl OO toot that replaces all of those. Unicode 6.1. Unicode complicates everything, and you'll be bored of hearing me say that by the end of the morning. So if you want to know what's new in Unicode 6.1, then that's the web page on the Unicode Consortium's web page. A brief summary. This latest version adds characters to support additional languages of China, other Asian countries and Africa. It also addresses the educational needs in the Arabic-speaking world, so a total of 732 new characters have been added. So that's useful. Right, so that finishes our little whiz through Perl 5.16. Anybody have any questions on any of that? Anyone surprised by any of that? Anyone think, oh, that's really useful, I didn't know that that was there, I'll be using that as soon as I get home?
I like fold case.
You like the idea of fold case? Because you have fought the demons of Unicode, so you understand why it's necessary. Or at least why it makes your life easy. Great. Moving on to 5.18. So, as I said, Perl comes out in about May time, so May 2013, Perl 5.18 was released. A few updates. Interestingly, 2 updates on the same day. I'm guessing there was a slight issue with Perl 5.18. What we're going to look at, no warnings is experimental, the hash rework, lexical subroutines, smart match marked as experimental, lexical underscore is experimental, $/ changes its behaviour, and a parsing bug that was fixed around QW. Oh, and another new version of Unicode. So there's this new warnings category added called experimental. And basically everything that's marked as an experiment has a warning that is in this category. As I say, if you try to use an experimental feature, you'll get a warning, which you should read as, do you really want to do this? I warned you if you use an experimental feature. So if you know you want to use an experimental feature, and you don't want your logs filling up with warnings, calling you an idiot for using an experimental feature, then you put no warnings, experimental, : and then the name of the feature that you want to use. And when we talk about some experimental features over the next hour or so, I'll show you what goes in place of foo in order to turn off the warnings for that. So basically, this says to Perl, don't warn me that I'm using experimental feature foo, or I know what I'm doing here.
Or I think I know.
Or I think I know what I'm doing here. So this is the big one in this version of Perl. So there's a big change in the way that hashes are implemented. Basically meaning that hash ordering is even more random than it previously was. Now using a random seed in the hashing algorithm, which means that keys and values and those sort of each will return things in a different order each time you run your program. This is to protect us against algorithmic complexity attacks. But what it means is that previously, if you'd have run this code, so we just set up a hash and then said the keys of it, we would have, on a given machine, or even maybe even on a given architecture, we would have always got the keys back in the same order. But now each time we run it, we get the keys back in random order. Yeah, so previously we would have got things back in the same order each time. Now you can't rely at all on the order of your hash keys or your hash values. And it's a stupid thing to do anyway, but boy did it expose weaknesses in tests. I was working at the time for a large online retailer, and we held up switching to Perl 518 for about a year whilst our test suite got fixed. And it was annoying because there were no actual problems. There were no actual bugs introduced in the code base by upgrading to Perl 518. It was just that not all our tests. A significant number of our tests failed. And we had to fix the tests in order to convince management that the code still worked. Yeah, so very careful testing required if you go to Perl 518. Or past Perl 518, obviously. Lexical subroutines. I confess, this had passed me by, actually. I like to think that I'm in touch with what's going on in new versions of Perl, but somehow I completely missed this. And it's nice, I like it. So I only found it because I was going through all the Perl deltas in order to write this talk. So it's an experimental feature, so in order to turn off that warnings, you say no warnings experimental lexical subs. But what it gives you is truly private subroutines that are only visible within your current lexical scope. And you declare them either with a state keyword, so state sub and then your standard subroutine definitions, or my sub and your standard subroutine. Has anybody seen or used this? That one. Why have you got state versus my? Well, it's the same way as you have with lexical variables. You have state, which is a lexical variable that retains its value within calls to the scope, or my, which is a lexical variable which loses its value in between different calls to the scope. Obviously, for variables, it's usually good if they get reset to undef each time the scope is called. If you're with a subroutine, I'm guessing you generally want the subroutine definition to stay in place in between calls to the subroutine or call to the scope that defines the subroutine. So you find yourself using state more than my here, because stateless subroutines will be slightly faster because they don't get recreated each time that scope is invoked. But you need my subroutines for closures because they get new views of the variables that are in the calling scope. And there's also an hour if you want to give yourself access to a global subroutine of the same name of a lexical subroutine that you've already got access, you've already declared. But that way lies madness, as far as I'm concerned. So just how does this lead to private subroutines? So we're very used to naming private subroutines with a leading underscore. Has anyone not ever done that? Yeah, so you have a subroutine called "Don't run this," which means please don't run this, but there's nothing that I can do to stop you running this. But now we can enforce this by calling state subroutine can't run this, and only people within the lexical scope can have access to that subroutine. So if you've got a subroutine in a library, in a different package, that you only want people in that package to call, if you put state in front of its definition, then people can't call it outside the subroutine, outside that lexical scope. So that's quite nice, I thought. And like I say, it's something that is completely passing on. Smart match. Smart match is confusing. Smart match has changed a few times. Smart match should probably be avoided. Smart match was introduced in Perl 5.10 and everyone said, hey, look at this wonderful new tool. And then it got out there in the wild and people started using it and people thinking, that's not actually as useful as we thought it was going to be, and it's slightly more magical than people were comfortable with. And so now it's marked as experimental. So no warnings, experimental, smart match. And it warns if you use the double tilde, which is the smart match operator, but it also warns if you use given and when, which under the covers they both use the smart match operator. And actually that large retailer I was talking about working at, we also had a load of problems with this because suddenly our error logs were in the test environment. Obviously we didn't go live with it. They were full of these warnings about using the smart match, because Perl 5.10 had come out and everyone thought, oh cool, we'll use that, and our code base was full of it.
Did you use it for anything but check if a value is inside the list? Because I threw a couple of those out of our code base and it was always just for this.
Yeah, I think we had some clever people in that, working on that code base, so there was a lot of other uses used. So this is basically the quote that comes from the Perl Delta page. So what does it say? It says, although there are a number of ways in which it's useful, it's also proven problematic and confusing for both users and implementers of Perl. And not just the users that get confused by it, it's the people that are actually writing the damn stuff. It's clear that smart match is almost certainly either going to change or go away in the future. Relying on its current behaviour is not recommended, and that's pretty harsh stuff. Yeah. So you probably don't want to be using smart match. Lexical underscore is also experimental. So this was another thing that was introduced in 5.10. And the quote said here is, it has caused much confusion with no obvious solution. So that's now marked as experimental. Probably, in fact, so you can turn off the warnings this way. But as a spoiler, reading ahead, it was actually taken out in Perl 5.24. So you really shouldn't use it because you'll eventually get to a version of Perl where it's not there. Okay, so special variables in Perl. $slash. $slash is the file read delimiter. It declares if you read a line from a file handle using the file input operators, you know, the angle brackets, Perl will read up to and including the next occurrence of whatever is in $slash. And $slash by default is set to a line feed. So everything works lovely. There are a few special values that you can set $/2. Does anyone know what any of them are? What happens if you set $/ undefined? It slurps the whole of the file, the next read, because there's no character for it to look for. What happens if you set $/ to a empty string? That's different to undef.
First empty string finds?
Sorry?
First empty string finds?
No. Good try though.
Reads a character?
It's a special. It's a special setting that gives it a different character.
Reads a character?
No. It puts Perl in paragraph mode. It reads a paragraph at a time, by which it's looking for basically 2 line feeds in succession, which mark a blank line in between. I use that quite a lot. I'm surprised people don't know that. And the other special value that you can set $/ to is a reference to an integer. So just to /512. And what that does is it reads that number of characters on the next read. So if you're reading some kind of binary file and you know that the records are a certain length, you can set $/ to that integer, and the next time you read data in, you'll get that number of, well, it used to be that number of bytes.
Yeah, because Unicode.
Yeah. So previously it read that number of bytes. Now it reads that number of characters because Unicode complicates everything. And that's normally what you want. You're normally thinking about characters. Yeah, and as I say, Unicode does complicate everything. QW. Oh, this is fixing a little parsing glitch in Perl. So up until Perl 5.18, you could write code like this. For each QW foo bar bad. But actually, that's wrong, because the QW is an operator that creates a list, and then you need brackets around that in order for the for each to work. Previously, Perl, I don't know whether it was a mistake or a feature that got added, Perl used to silently add the missing parentheses. And now it doesn't. So now you need to write that. You need to put the brackets in. And I've actually seen 2 or 3 questions on Stack Overflow where people have tried to run old code on a new version of Perl and they've bumped up against this. So this problem does exist out there in the wild. But of course, none of you would have been lazy enough to write code like that in the first place. You would have known that that's the correct way to write it. Another new version of Unicode. Unicode complicating everything again. There's a web page that explains what's in it. Oh, but this was a special release that was rushed out purely so that it could include the new Turkish lira sign. So if you deal with Turkish currency, you're golden. Anybody deal with Turkish currency regularly? Okay. Any more questions on Perl 5.18? Anything cool or problematic?
Just a general question.
Yes.
If you're creating an app which you want to support, say 5.10 onwards,
Yes.
how could you have features which is only available in 14, 16 or 18? Can you have something like that?
Well, you have a
Depending
choice.
what environment is people is running under, so you can take the benefit of 5.14 feature in case it's there. If not, then fall back to something like 5.10 or whatever.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. That's an interesting question. So you can there's a special variable which gives you the Perl version number. I think it's $open square bracket or something really meaningful like that. And so in some cases you can say if Perl version is this, then do this, otherwise do that. However, some of this stuff is actually changes to the compiler. And the code that you put in your if-else branch, it still has to compile, even though you're not going to run it. So you do have problems. I actually ran up against this recently. I was trying to add some tests to a CPAN module. So that to prove that it worked in a couple of versions' time, we're going to look at the new hash slicing. But that's completely new syntax, and I couldn't add tests to the version of, to my module because my module is supposed to run on Perl 5.10, and I don't want. One of the really sad things for me is a lot of the code that I write is for CPAN, and really for CPAN, I don't want to be addressing Perl 5.20 or Perl 5.18. So I can't use a lot of these cool features, otherwise people will stop using my modules. Well, I mean, no one uses my modules anyway, because they're all rubbish. Does that answer your question? So moving on to Perl 5.20. What time are we supposed to finish it? 11?
11.
11. Okay, we're doing good time. Perl 5.20 came out in 2014, and there have been 3 updates. The most recent came out, just over a year ago. What we're going to look at here: subroutine signatures, an experimental feature that I'd really like to use in my CPAN modules. These are the hash and array slices that I was just mentioning. Postfix dereferencing, again, something else I'd really like to start using on CPAN, Unicode. So subroutine signatures. Subroutines can now have a signature. Hurrah! Only like 40 years after every other programming language in the world.
But they are the best subroutine signature.
So you can now write sub foo brackets $baz code. You need to have use feature signatures. It's experimental, so you need to have no warnings experimental features. So it's questionable how much typing you're saving at this point. So yeah, this defines 2 mandatory parameters that need to be passed into your subroutine. So check the number of parameters that get passed and throws an exception if it gets to the one. And then it assigns the parameters to lexical variables called $bar and $baz. You can have unnamed parameters by using the dollar without a name, like this. You've still got past 3 parameters, but only the first and the third ones are assigned to variables. But it's still available because you could still get all of the parameters in in @ underscore. You can have optional parameters by giving them a default. So subfoo bar baz equals 0. If you don't pass a second value, then it gets assigned a value of 0. And then at the end of the parameter list, you can have slurpy parameters, which you can assign to an array. So basically this now takes any number of arguments, and the first argument gets put into $bar, and then any other arguments you pass get put into an array baz. So if you call foo ABC, then bar gets A and baz ended up with B and C. Or you can say the slurpy parameters go into a hash, just by putting a hash symbol there, So now if you call foo ABC, you get A in bar, and Baz ends up with a key of B and a value of C. And I'm assuming that if the extra parameters that you pass in is, if you pass in an odd number, then you'll get the odd number assigned to a hash warning that you would normally expect to get. Has anyone been using this? A couple of people? Anyone excited to start using this? Anyone thinking, if only we weren't stuck using Perl 5.10, I'd love to use this? Is that a yes or a question?
That was a yes.
Does anybody have any questions?
When will we get named arguments?
Differently to what? This, how? What else do you want?
For example, if I have a $foo and $bar, and I can pass in bar and foo in reverse order.
Oh, I see what you mean, yes. Ask the chap behind you.
Well, first, we're making those faster.
Okay.
But that's all.
So we have a reason, so you can tell your employer, well, this will be faster if we use it than what we have now. Pretty good reason to move.
Yeah, cool. Oh yes, of course, with the Slurpee hash, you can make the syntax look a little nicer too, by using the fat arrow. So this is the new slice syntax that I mentioned I couldn't get tested for in my project. So I'm hoping you all understand what an array slice is. It looks like this. And you have an array name, you give it the @ symbol, because we're talking plural, and then you give it a list of indexes, and you get back a list of the values that correspond to those indexes. We've all used that, right? So that returns 4 elements from the array. What I don't have on the slide, I don't think, is that you can also use an array slice on the left-hand side of an assignment. And instead of giving you 4 values back from the array, it gives you 4 buckets in the array that you can put values into. Yeah? You can also have hash slices. So again, because we're getting a list of values back, we have the @ sign, because it's kind of the closest thing we have to a list in Sigil world. And we can pass it a list of keys, and we get the 3 values that are associated with those keys, which we can then store in an array. Everyone with me there? Has anyone not used stuff like this? I use this all the time. It's one of my favourite Perl features. And what the thing that people don't sometimes realise that you can do is that you can actually use this also on the left-hand side of an assignment. So you can actually, that will then give you 3 buckets in your hash, which you can then put 3 values into. So that returns 3 values from the hash. But what we don't have here is what we get back from our hash slice isn't anything that looks anything like a hash. It's just the values, or it's just the slots, the key slots that you can put values into. So we get basically a one-dimensional list of values back. But now we have these new hash-style hash slices and array slices, which looks a bit like the old hash slice syntax, but it has a hash sign, a percent sign, rather than the array symbol at the start. And what this does, it actually gives you a hash back, rather than just a list of values. So you can say percent hash foo bar baz, and it gives you back the keys and the values in matched pairs, so you can just assign them to a new hash. So it's a nice, quick way of making a sub-hash from an existing hash. That's a really good feature. You can also do it with arrays. Less useful, I think. Yeah, because what you get back, if you view, you can view an array as a hash, and the keys are the indexes. So this actually gives you back those three values, but also paired with the indexes that they are. So you'll get 1, and then whatever is at index 1, and 3, and whatever is at index 3, 4, etc. So, I don't know, I'm not convinced that that's going to be massively useful to me, but the hash one, I think, I like that.
How is it assigned?
Sorry?
How is it assigned to add slice?
How is...
Assign.
Oh, so this
What's
will give you back 8 elements.
okay?
So the 4, so it would be 1, followed by whatever is in element 1.
So you'll have 8 elements.
And then, so you'll get 8 elements.
Okay.
You might, it might make more sense to assign it to an array. Sorry, to a hash.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so that returns 4 indexed element pairs. Postfix dereferencing. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, what? And I couldn't really see the point, but I'm coming around to it. And it's experimental, so you need to do no warnings, experiment, post deref. So it's a new syntax for dereferencing things. One of the big advantages is that it follows this sort of left to right sequence of doing things throughout. I'll explain, I think on the following slide, what I mean. Basically, if you've got a scalar reference, now people really don't very often use scalar references, but if you wanted to dereference a scalar reference, you just put it in braces with a dollar sign in front. And now you have this new syntax, scalar reference, arrow, dollar, star. Similar thing, now this is more commonly used to, if you've got an array reference and you want to get back to the referenced array, the actual array, you would commonly use a syntax like this. You might actually drop the braces, but you can use this arrow at star. Same for hash references, same for code references, and even the same for references to type jobs, which is nice even because you have 2 stars.
Just the question, who here uses this? No. I was kind of wondering if it was popular. I think that the version on the right might be easier to read, or more intuitive, like what you're doing.
Yeah, so you're exactly where I was when I first read this. This is unnecessary new syntax, but as I said, I've really warmed to it. Largely because of this. So you've got a relatively complicated expression that at the end of it is going to return a reference to an array, and you want to get back to the referenced array. So you've got some reference that you know is a hash reference, so you look up value foo. That returns you an array reference, so you get the first element from that array reference. And then that gives you a hash reference, so you look up key bar in that. And you know that's going to return you an array reference. And here you're going, okay, I'm starting from the reference, I'm moving to the right, I'm moving to the right, I'm moving to the right, and then when I get to this point, when I've got my array reference and I want to then turn that into the whole array, oh, actually I'm going to go all the way back to the left. And so it makes your code less scannable, less easy for the eye to actually easily follow what's going on. So in the new style, you go, okay, go to the right, go to the right, go to the right. I've got my final array reference. I want to dereference that, and I carry on going to the right. It's that little bit smoother. Now, obviously, there's a learning curve, and you need to train your brain to recognise this new syntax. But I think once you get used to it, it is going to be easier to read than the old style.
Can I still put arrow in between 4 and 0 in the new style? The
Oh,
new
here?
style, the new style.
Yes.
Can I put-
Yes. When you're dereferencing multi-level data structures, when there's an array dereferencing, when there's an array index brackets next to a hash index bracket, the only way that makes any kind of sense to Perl is if you're doing multi-level dereferencing. So there can be, in all of these places, there can be arrows there, but because that's the only thing that it can be, they are always optional.
But the arrow is required before the last surgery?
I think so, yes. I'm going to try out. It's like in my recent client I've been working with, I bumped up against the my manager who was doing all my code reviews, because he's a big believer that these arrows should always be there. It's hardwired in my fingers not to put those arrows there, and he was always getting back to me saying, no, you need arrows and stuff. Sorry, before we move on from that, go back. Any questions on this? It's a big change. It's one of the big things in this version of Perl, but
It's experimental.
it's marked as experimental. Well, it's experimental in this version of Perl. Spoilers, it's not anymore.
Just a general question. It's nice to know all these new features, but the real world, in the day job, you work in a quite lower version of Perl, and if you are a CPAN contributor, you want to have an even lower version support. But when is a good time? There's never be a good time to use this feature. It's only when you come to this class like this you get to know this and go back to the old version.
For CPAN, I agree, and I mentioned that earlier that I'm targeting five. I think I've got some CPAN modules that still target 5.6. Most of my modules I've now moved to 5.10. For your day job, my answer to that is that if you're stuck on an old version of Perl, then you should upgrade your version of Perl, or your sysadmin, or your job as appropriate.
In that order?
Well, that's the order at which you should attack the issue. If you've got the power to upgrade the version of Perl, then you should be looking at doing that. If you can't, then you need to be buying beer for your sysadmins so that they will upgrade version of Perl. And if that doesn't work, then there are companies out there in London who are committed to using recent, maybe not the most recent, but recent versions of Perl.
You have tried replacing the supplied version of Perl with an OS.
Well, you just
I mean,
you just build your own version and put it in /opt, and then all your Perl code just accesses that version instead. Or, I mean, you include the version of Perl within your application. And of course, these days, we're all using containerized applications or virtual machines that only run one microservice at a time, so we can install whatever we want on our little machine that runs our application. I know that's a perfect world, and I know that not everyone is there, but it's nice to have something to aim at. So yeah, there are, I mean, I think it's worth fighting these battles and getting better versions of Perl. Although having said that, I have just come off a 5-month contract where I used Perl 5.10 every day. And they were really happy that they had just before I joined, they just moved off Perl 5.88. To me, that would have been a deal breaker. Currently, Perl 5.10.10 is my absolute, sorry, Perl 5.10.1 is my absolute minimal. Don't get out of bed for anything less than Perl 5.10. Right, so yeah, this is powerful but takes some getting used to. And my batteries are running out on this. I've got some spare ones somewhere. So Unicode, we've got another version of Unicode. And that's a special, it's a special release focused on delivering significantly improved bi-directional behaviour. So that makes us all very happy, I'm sure. Any more questions on Perl 5.20 before we move on? Pause for a few seconds whilst I change my batteries.
So where are we year-wise with 5.22?
So 5.24 is this year, so 5.22 was last year.
Oh, okay, right.
That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, so actually with, that's kind of important, I suppose, with don't you hate people that put dead batteries back in batteries? Me, I did that. Okay. Yeah, so the important thing with 5.22 is we're now in the realm of a supported version of Perl. Yeah, so last June, I said they come out in April and May, that one's just slipped to the 1st of June. Current version 22.2. What we're going to look at? Bitwise operators, double diamond operators. Is anyone in the room old enough for me to make a beer joke about double diamond? A couple of you. Some new regex boundaries, new /n option on regexes, Unicode, and then some nice cleanups of dodgy Perl code, which we'll look at in a bit more detail. And then some things, this is quite a big one actually, some things taken out. So let's start by looking at these bitwise operators. Who uses bitwise operators all the time? Well, not many. Not many people use it. So can anyone tell me what those 4 bitwise operators do?
It's
Yeah, so complement, and, or, and XOR.
Yeah.
And they're called bitwise because they work on the individual bits of the value rather than on the actual overriding value of your value. You see what I mean? They expect to get numbers as their operand. They kind of work on strings as well. They don't really care whether you give them strings. And it can be difficult to control, well, there's no way to control the numeric string differentiation. So, use feature bitwise, and no warnings experimental bitwise, because these are experimental. Or actually you can shortcut it for some reason. There's a shortcut version of doing that. And then it changes the behaviours of the old operators so they are always new expect numerics, and there are new string bitwise operators, which are the same as the old bitwise operators, just with a dot after them, which makes that line of my slide look rather confusing, I'm afraid. But for the two of you that put your hands up about using bitwise operators, this might be interesting. Right, the double diamond operator.
Sorry, just a quick question.
Yes.
Is there any reason why the period on the XOR is on the other side from all the others?
That's
Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, I was having difficulty reading it.
yeah. No, I understand completely. I do need to make that clearer. But it wouldn't be entirely impossible for me to have made a typo. But yes, the dot does follow the operator in that case. Right, the double diamond operator. Looks just like the standard diamond operator. But it always uses the 3-argument version of open, which is the safer version of open that we always recommend that people use these days. Which means that, so the diamond operator works across all of the file names that you give on the command line. So all the things that are in app, RB, and so they're always treated as file names. The side effect of that is that something with a pipe, so piping into a process, won't work with the double diamond operator, but for any other use it works wonders. New regex boundaries, so some extensions to /b. You've seen /b, which means, well, what does /b mean? Okay, everyone says it means word boundary, and that's correct, but what does that actually mean?
Well, depends on Unicode, I guess, again.
For the next 2 minutes, let's ignore Unicode. What does it mean to say it's a word boundary?
That it separates a bunch of things that aren't a white space, or something like that.
Well, separates that letter from something else.
Not doing very well.
It's a very existential question.
It's not an existential question. It's defined clearly in the documentation. A word boundary is the point between a /w character and a /W character. So what's a /W character, Matt?
White space. White space.
No, that's S, is white space.
No,
A word character.
A word character. What's a word character?
What goes between two boundaries?
Z09 dash underscore
Yeah,
space.
but what is smiley?
Sorry?
What about the smiley face? Is that word character?
No.
I didn't think I was opening quite such a big can of worms here. /W is a word character, and it's defined as the valid characters in a Perl identifier, which is all alphanumeric characters plus the underscore. That's it. /W is
Everything else.
everything else. So a /B, the word boundary character, is any point in your string where a word character is followed by a non-word character, or vice versa. Are we clear? Have we all learned something useful? Which actually means it's absolutely useless for matching words. Because words contain punctuation characters that are non-word characters. So we now have /B word boundary, which tries to do a better job of actually matching words. Modulo Unicode and stuff like that. We have /B SB, which is a sentence boundary. and we have /b. Oh, sorry, question.
Sorry, can you just say something about punctuation within words? It seems like a hyphen.
Yeah, hyphen or apostrophe is very common. Don't, can't, won't. And we've got /b GCB, which matches a boundary between two graphene clusters. And we're all clear with what a graphene cluster is, right?
That would be unique.
So like a letter with a diaresis?
Yes. So Unicode. It's possible in Unicode to have a character that is actually, when I say character, I mean a character that you view on your screen that is made up of more than one actual character. So if you have a E acute, E with an acute accent on. Now, right back to the days of ISO 88591, we've had a character that matches E with an acute character on. However, when the Unicode consortium started looking into encoding all known human languages, because you've got to have an ambition, they very quickly realised that encoding, coming up with an encoding for every accented character, every combination of accented character, was a recipe for disaster. So they came up with a scheme where you can have a character which is made up of multiple encoded characters. So as well as having the E acute character in your Unicode character set, you also have an E and a combining acute accent character. So you can have the two characters next to each other, and that means E acute. And so when you have multiple Unicode characters next to each other that form a single printable character, viewable character, that is known as a graphene cluster. Question?
Just a small comment. Another example would be coloring, like a red heart. You take red and you take a heart, you create a single glyph that's like a red heart.
And presumably also the recent release of emoji with faces with different skin colours.
Yeah, skin tones also.
Yes. Are we clear now? Are we all going to rush off and start using this?
The sentence boundary, does that match, I imagine, boundaries, not just like periods, but say the Japanese word boundary, for instance, which is like a circle.
I would hope so. I haven't tested it.
Right. But that's I guess the aim.
Yeah.
Unicode.
Yeah, isn't there a Unicode property that defines a sentence end character? And that's what that is.
Right.
So as long as the Unicode consortium have got it right, and we have correctly implemented their standards, then everything will just work. Just. The /n option on regexes. So there's a new option that goes on /m and /s, blah blah blah, which turns off. Yeah, that's a typo. I'm trying to work out what I'm trying to type. Turns off all capturing. Turns off all capturing. So if you've got a regular expression and you've got the brackets with /w plus, and we know what /w matches now. So as a side effect of that match, it fills in the variable $1. Yep, we're all clear about that. But if you put this new /n, it means no capturing. And so those brackets are then just being used for grouping. For grouping, yes. My mind's something I'm playing. Grouping. So we've had for many years these extended characters in regular expressions, and that says make this a grouping set rather than a capturing set. But if you want to easily do that for all of the groups in your regular expression, just stick slash n. It's a nice little change. Unicode 7. Added another 2,834 characters, with 23 new scripts, many symbols, and additions to existing scripts. I think I might even have a little bit more detail. So 2 new currency symbols, the manat for people that are travelling in Azerbaijan, and the ruble. I was surprised that the ruble
It's so
didn't...
late.
Sorry?
So late.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, yeah, they can just use the square box, you know, before.
They finally got around to adding wingdings. 23 new, lesser used and historic scripts from all over the place, Africa. And I was so happy to finally see letters used in Tooth and Isla. This will make my life so much easier. But it's great that we've got it. Right, so now we're getting to this was a bit of a clean-up of a load of stuff that shouldn't ever have compiled. And I'm kind of hesitant to show you this stuff because most of you won't know that you could even ever do any of this stuff. So there were some obscure circumstances where you could omit the percent sign and the @ sign on array and hash names and it wouldn't complain and it would just work. But that's a very stupid thing to do. It's raised a deprecation warning since 5.0 and they finally got around to making it a fatal error. So hurrah for that.
It's going to go.
Yes. Defined array and defined hash have never made any sense. So that's another part of things. It's deprecated since 5.6.1 back in the last millennium. Yes, but so it's kind of a weird one that it's deprecated in as much as documentation has said that this is meaningless. But it was only at 5.16 that it actually issued a deprecation warning, and now it's a fatal error. And this is another one that's popped up on Stack Overflow in the last couple of months. On Stack Overflow, you often get this thing where people they've got their own, they've got a script that they've downloaded. They aren't a programmer. They aren't any kind of programmer. Let alone a Perl programmer. And they've just installed this really old script, and suddenly it doesn't work because they're installing it on a system that's got a reasonably up-to-date version of Perl. And it was throwing fatal errors for a defined array. And people are saying, well, you need to change. You need to change this to just everywhere where you've got if defined array. You probably just mean if array. So just go and make that change. And he's going, I'm not a programmer. Someone just told me how to fix it. Well, we just did. No, but I don't want how to fix it without changing the code. Good luck with that. Yeah. And another one, but you didn't know you could do this? Oh, no, you can't. Because again, it's a stupid thing. Hashes and arrays are actually references, so you can treat them as references and look at that, but don't do that because now it's going to be a fatal error. Nobody can actually work out when the deprecation for it came in. So the release notes just say it was deprecated since before 5.8. Perl Unicook. So a new cookbook of Unicode recipes, written by Tom Christensen. And if you haven't seen anything that Tom Christensen has written about Unicode, you know he's kind of obsessive, and this is huge. but it is well worth reading. It's one of the highest scoring Stack Overflow answers of all time. Somebody asked a question, why Perl doesn't just do Unicode right by default. Tom wrote this novel explaining exactly why it couldn't do it right, and that's now an edited version of that. So if you think you don't care about Unicode, you are wrong. And the number of times I run training courses for companies, and I'll be talking to them about what subjects they want to cover. I'll say, well, I could do a 2-hour session on Unicode. And they're like, oh, we don't use Unicode. And I'm like, you're wrong, but whatever, it's your money.
Enjoy your white character.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you don't, I'm just joking about Unicode complicates everything, but read this and you'll know how true I am. Find to Perl, A to Perl, and S to Perl. Old programs that were converted from, that took a program that was written in Fine or Org or Sed and converted them into Perl code. They've been sitting there in the Perl distribution for years. Nobody has, well, prove me wrong, has anyone used any of these ever?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I tried to.
How recently?
10 years ago.
10 years ago, right. No one had maintained them for years, so the Perl that they generated was horrible. But they're gone. No one cares that they're gone. People care that this is gone. And I'm not going to open the whole discussion can of worms because we could be here for 10 hours. It's a contentious move. But I hope we all agree that CGI is now a terrible way to write web applications. You never gave your CGI PM is dead talk here, did you?
It's on CPAN though.
Yes. So, including CGI.pm as part of the Perl distribution was seen as a kind of endorsement of a terrible way to write web programs, and that's the overriding reason why it is now gone. So best to just remove it, use PSGI or PLAC or something based on them instead. I meant to add the final point that Sawyer just mentioned. It is, of course, still there on CPAN. We aren't saying you can't use it. We're saying we might look at you, we might point and laugh at you if you do use it, but no. It is still there, and you can use it if you want, but we don't want to make you think that it's the right thing to do. Module build was removed, slightly less contentious. So this was written, I guess it goes back about 12 years ago. It was written as a replacement for XUtils and MakeMaker, and I remember seeing Schwern give talks called things like XUtils MakeMaker is doomed, and all the reasons why we shouldn't be using XUtils MakeMaker, and module build was the replacement. The main reason was that XUtils MakeMaker relies on external programs like Make, and you can't always guarantee that Make is installed. Whereas module build has its own internal code that does the same thing. It was written in pure Perl, it didn't use Make, it ran across all platforms, but it's kind of seen as a failed experiment. Again, it's still there on CPAN, and my CPAN modules all still use it because 10 years ago I moved them all across to module build, and I haven't gone around to moving them on to something else yet. Any questions on Perl 5.22? Good. Either means I'm making perfect sense, or I've lost you all. Perl 5.24, current version of Perl, released on the 9th of May this year. I meant to check this morning. Last time I checked, there hadn't been an update to it. What we're looking at, there you go, post-fix dereferencing is no longer experimental. Code 8. more boundaries, shebang changes, auto deref removed. Yes, and not much to say about this postfix dereferencing. Postfix dereferencing, the way of doing things from left to right, that was added in Perl 520. It's deemed a success, and therefore it's no longer experimental. So you don't need to use the experimental postfix deref stuff.
Were there any changes that made it non-experimental?
No, so I think it's just made more experimental in exactly the form that it was before.
Okay.
Question?
For something to be non-experimental anymore, it has to go through at least 2 versions in which there are no behavioral changes.
Okay, so it was introduced 2 versions ago, nothing has changed, and therefore. Okay. Unicode 8. 7,700 new characters. 6 new scripts. What did they say? Cherokee!
Wow.
CJK is Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Oh, the skin tone stuff that we were talking about just now. The Gregorian Lari currency symbol. Hallelujah. Lots of West African languages. Yeah, lots of stuff. Another new boundary, the regexes. This is obviously when I was working very tough. I've mentioned potential line break. I can't even blame autocorrect because I was typing on my desktop. I don't have autocorrect on my desktop. So there's a place where you could potentially break a line if you want to. So your typesetting, perhaps that might be useful to you. And it's based again on a Unicode property. And if you're not using that, Perl 524, there's on CPAN a Unicode line break module which implements the same thing. The shebang readouts to Perl 6. So if you put a shebang in your Perl code, which obviously most of us do, and if that shebang line includes a program that isn't Perl, then Perl will say, okay, I'm going to run this, I'm going to forward it on to and call the other program in the shebang line. So if you try to run a program that starts usually in Ruby with Perl, it will run because Perl says, no, this is Ruby code, off you go, and passes it over to Ruby. But there used to be an exception that if the path contained Perl, the string Perl, it wouldn't do that redirection. But now it works if the redirection, if the shebang string includes Perl 6, it will call Perl 6. So now you can write a Perl 6 program, put username Perl 6 in the top, and then you can run it with Perl because it will be automatically redirected. Auto deref. Now auto deref, obviously we started with Perl 5.16. So in the previous version of this talk, we covered Perl 5.14, and that talked about a thing called auto deref, where array and hash functions worked on references instead of just the things themselves. So, I mean, we're all used to passing. If you've got an array reference and you want to push something onto the referenced array, you need to dereference the reference, and then you can push it. But from Perl 5.14, these functions were changed so that you could just pass in the array reference or the hash reference. So it works with keys and values and push and shift and all of those kinds of functions. But that was it has been deemed unsuccessful by the powers that be, and now does not exist in Perl 5.24. So if you've been coding in Perls from Perl 5.14 and you've made use of this feature, then when you upgrade to 5.24 you're going to have to undo all those changes. Sorry about that. A little sneak peek ahead to 5.26, which will be out next spring. Currently, if you want to see what's going on, you can have a look in Perl 5.25. And well, for a development version of Perl, new versions come out pretty much every month. So what's the current version? 5, 6?
6 or 7.
Something like that, yeah.
No, because it released in the next
Perfect question.
So lexical subroutines will lose their experimental status, and that's what I said. It means that they've gone through no changes for 2 versions. And no one's complained, so that's good. It will have Unicode 9, and you'll be able to declare references to variables like that by reference to %x to $, right? So that was a brief run through the last 5 or 6 versions of Perl and some of the big changes, some of the smaller changes, and some of the Unicode. How do we stay up to date with what's going on in Perl? So there's kind of 2 questions that we need to ask ourselves, we need to know the answer to. Firstly, we want to know, how do we know when a new version of Perl has come out? And secondly, we want to know what is in that new version of Perl when it comes out. So how do we keep up to date with Perl news? There's a Perl Foundation Twitter account, there's Reddit, Perl Weekly. I'll look at these in a bit more detail. So the Perl Foundation Twitter account has a load of followers, 7,000 followers. It's run by volunteers, it's run by people from the TPA. And so I say that to explain that they might not always announce new Perl news the second that it happens. But it tries to be the first to get out, to get important Perl news out to you. So if you are on Twitter, then it's well worth a follow. Reddit. Few people, myself included, have put a bit of effort in over the last couple of years to try and build up the Perl subreddit. So it's our Perl, and we like to publish links to interesting articles and announcements and things like that. You also get to help students with their Perl homework. And then there's the Perl Weekly, which is a email that is curated by humans, so it's not like any kind of automatic thing. There are a small team of people that every week trawl through all the Perl news feeds that they can find and build up email of the most interesting links for you to read. And there's also an RSS feed if you're old school enough to still like reading web feeds. I really recommend signing up to this, it's really useful. So what is in the new release? Well, every time a new version of Perl comes out, there's a manual page called Perl Delta, Perl Changes. And that is effectively the release notes for the new version. So, I mean, I knew a lot of the things that I wanted to cover in this talk when I was writing it, but part of what I did in order to write these slides was to go back and read pages and pages and pages of Perl deltas, because the older versions are also available. They have, so the most recent one is always just called Perl Delta, and the older versions will be called something like Perl 510 Delta. So there's a lot of reading in there, but what I do is whenever a new version of Perl comes out, I set aside a couple of hours in an afternoon to at least skim through the Perl Delta, so I know what's going on.
With some good wine and cheese and just kind of quality time.
Yeah, quality time with me and my Perl Delta. So just briefly in conclusion, so Perl has an annual release cycle. And there are interesting and useful changes in each Perl release. If you're not keeping up to date, then you are missing out on stuff. So it's well worth keeping yourself up to date, keeping your knowledge up to date, but it's also well worth spending the effort to try and get your organisation to keep up to date. Because it must be kind of depressing if you were, say, somebody running the Perl project, and you come in and in a talk like this and you find that everyone's still using Perl 5.8 or 5.10 or something like that. You must think, well, why bother? So I just hope that this last couple of hours has given you a reason to upgrade. So it's something to take back to your managers or your team and say, yeah, we really should think about moving up to Perl 5.24. So we've just got 5 minutes for questions and then a coffee break, which will have free cakes or something like that. Always well worth doing. I hope you don't mind if I just take 30 seconds to have a quick advert. So I've been running these sessions at the London Perl Workshop for a very long time now. I do have my own consultancy company, and I'm very happy to get involved in coming in and running Perl training on site for you, or Perl development, code review, architectural review, any of that kind of stuff. If you think that I can be of use to you or your organisation, then please feel free to email me. That's all I have time for. Does anybody have any final questions or points they wanted to make? Have we found it useful? Yes. We all want to run away and upgrade that version of Perl. What? Just press the right buttons. On your way out. Does anyone feel what particular things do they think they want to take away and start to use?
Unicode is important.
Anything else?
Regex expression, new.
Some of the new line boundary things. Postfix dereferencing. Thank you. Yes.
I think private subroutines was
Private
really good. Yeah, that's probably the